anybody reaches out and wants to get to me, that'd be great.
Will do. Thanks.
Thank you.
And then I also wanted to put in a plug for our next program, which will be Tuesday, May 18th, when Chris Rimmer from the Vermont Center for Eco Studies will be presenting about their Bicknell's thrush research and conservation efforts, which should be a really interesting program. And without further ado, please welcome Cherrie Corey tonight. She's going to be telling us about spring wildflowers, and Cherrie is an avid naturalist and great birder, and I'm excited to see what she has to tell us.
Good evening, everyone, and a special hello not only to all my Vermont friends, but to many friends who have so nicely tuned in from other states. So I decided, because I was hearing from some of you, to expand a bit some of the flowers that I included in here. So they're not, most are found in Vermont, but there are a few that are a little more far-flung. So tonight I'm going to be talking about spring ephemerals, and in loosely defined, because not all of the plants I'll be showing you come up, bloom, and fade away right away. I'm, as many of you know who've been on my walks, I'm someone who is not so inclined to label, although I will, as to really help you build a sense of the environment and the whole livelihood of the plants and birds that we're looking at, you know, who they live with, where on the landscape they are, what time of year they appear. And so I'm including, especially right up front, some birds that you are very likely around here or in Concord, where I've taken most of these photos. There's both places, Concord, Mass, and in the Brattleboro area. But the birds that I show up in both places when the spring ephemerals are blooming, and provide a bit of the soundscape or the soundtrack for your spring ephemeral viewing. So I've included those too. So let's get started. Please bear with me. This is, I think, only my second Zoom presentation, so hopefully it works well. Just a little introduction. Spring ephemerals, they come out and bloom in what turn out to be later in the spring and summer, shadier areas. But they come out while the sun is abundant and the moisture is also abundant, and they prefer both early on. But the true ephemerals that fade away after blooming and setting fruit and seed, they don't like the heat much. So what we'll be looking at today are places that if you were to go in July would be really quite shaded. They produce, the reason they can come up in late April, which is what they do pretty much from the east coast of Massachusetts all the way up through Vermont, except at higher elevations. But certainly in the Brattleboro area, they're all coming up somewhere around the last week of April, depending on how warm a spring it is. Still, it's the last week of April. In the last 4 years, I found that getting to see them in bloom and hitting it right has varied about a week, depending on how warm the spring was, just over the last four weeks. So somewhere between April 15th, if it's a warm spring, all the way up until almost May 1st. But this week is usually sort of prime week to see them. They are very busy producing sugars and starches for themselves, and they store those down into pretty substantial tuber systems underground, or corums, which are like little bulbs, and those hold on to that food until the following spring, so they can come up without a whole lot of additional assistance right as the season begins and make it through a major snowstorm in late April. Last week, we up here had 14 inches of snow. Most spring ephemerals prefer very nutrient-rich soils in forests. And most of us who go looking for them find them most readily on ledges, talus slopes, or in ravines. So if you're in Vermont, around here, and particularly in Western Vermont, where the soil has more calcareous properties to it, it's sweeter, you can drive along road cuts that have cut right through the bedrock or through outcroppings of stone and just see these from the road. In fact, that's often one of the best places to view these. And I just said that. And many of these plants have very special pollinator relationships because they're coming out early. And this sets them up for a bit of a perilous situation as climate change progresses, because the timing of their emergence with the timing of the very specific pollinators that either pollinate, feed on the pollen of, or drink the nectar of these plants, the timing has to fit together really well. Good, hopefully this will work. So we're going to take a walk in an area that is particularly rich in spring ephemerals, and I'm setting the stage for you here. On the left is a slope, it's a talus slope. There's also some outcropping near the bottom, but from what I can tell from the state map, this is a glacial came. So a lot of the rock that you see on this 60 to 80 foot high hillside is large glacial till, from what I can tell. But if anyone who knows this area, I'm not going to name it, but if you know it, you'll know it from seeing it. If you know that it's otherwise, just speak up. Here are the birds standing just in that spot that I was, and actually this week they were all there. Louisiana water thrush. I'm going to go back for a minute and show you. On the right is a stream, and on the left is this hillside. So the Louisiana water thrush for the last 4 years has this week in April been in the branches over that stream. Palm warblers, and there is some spice bush down at the base of the stream where you start up this road. Winter wren singing like mad, and it echoes off the hillside, and there's another hill on the other side further up. So wonderful songs from him. And hermit thrushes, who really love to work the mossy, wet ledges. All of them singing. And up in this space on the left that's dark under that ledge, or one that looks just like it, if that's not the exact one, is a raven's nest. And the ravens are calling up there all the time. So there's a lot of bird company as you're looking at these ledges. Lots of moss. And this, I want to give you a sense of the scale of what we're looking at, because when you start looking at the photos I'm about to show you, these plants look quite large. But in fact, in front of Amanda, who's in the front here, is Dutchman's breeches that she's looking at. And that's one of the larger plants on the ledge. So you really need to adjust your eyes to pick things out. Early saxifrage is one of the earliest plants to bloom here, and it's tiny, very, very tiny. And it pokes out of the cracks in the ledges. Alongside fragile fern, which at this time of year is also very tiny, very delicate, and very particularly fond of this habitat. Here are the Dutchman's breeches. They were pretty much in this stage this past weekend. And red trillium, in this particular site, there are probably hundreds of them, but most of them are about 50, 60 feet high. So you need binoculars to see them. It's a little like bird watching along these cliffs. Unfortunately, I don't have painted trillium. I haven't been up here long enough to get out and find some to photograph. So just imagine that they're there, because they are plentiful in this area. Trillium grandiflorum does not grow wild or hasn't been recorded wild in Windham County, but it is native to all of the western counties of Vermont and down through western Connecticut. It pretty much grows along the backbone of the Appalachian Ridge. Sharp-lobed hepatica is one of two hepaticas that grow in New England. This one is the less common one, and it is common in Western Mass and Vermont. The anemone americana, I think it is. The blunt lobe hepatica is pretty ubiquitous throughout New England. It blooms before its leaves come out, and it's very small. And these pictures, it looks much more robust than it typically does, and it can easily grow underfoot. So when you're in a rich area with ephemerals, be very, very careful where you step. Here are some leaves emerging after the blooms, or just as they're fading. Wild leeks or ramps pretty much cohabit these slopes and cliffs with spring ephemerals. So you'll see their glowing green leaves in and around them. And I wonder, I haven't researched this, but I'm guessing there may be some kind of symbiotic relationship, something that they do for one another. Now this, when I was learning the spring ephemerals, these particular wildflowers, this is not one, but I met this plant when I was first exploring these early spring wildflowers on the Heinsberg Cliffs. And those of you from the Brattleboro area probably know that road cut pretty well. The cliffs in that part of Heinsberg Road over in West Brattleboro used to be fantastic for spring ephemerals. Someone told me they cut the cliff back for better visibility on the road, but it looks to me like it was just pretty much devastated by Irene. It's very, very eroded. And most of the plants that I saw there in the 70s are just barely hanging in there now. But Eastern prickly gooseberry shows up with all of these plants, whether they're on a hillside or in a rich forest. And you will feel it if you don't see it first. Plantain leaf sedge also likes the same habitat, and it is a spectacular sedge. I think maybe one of the most beautiful. I thought I included another image, but I guess I didn't. Its leaves are sort of seersucker-like, and it's all over some of the cliffs in this area. And this particular plant, those leaves were more than a foot long, just hanging off the side with these just beautiful tufted sedge flowers. And stinging nettle also is often found in the ledge habitats or the rich, moist soil with spring ephemerals. And I, in fact, was introduced to it in that spot on Heinsberg Cliffs. I was walking along to, not on the cliffs, but below them to look at some Dutchman's breeches, and I thought I'd been stung by bees. But it was a plentiful supply of stinging nettle. This is my favorite wildflower, I think maybe of all. It's called two-leaved miterwort. It refers to a mitre of royalty. Some have referred to it as looking like a crown or a tiara. I think it clearly looks like a snowflake. And why it isn't called a snowflake flower, I don't know. But it's an incredible plant. And if you are walking along those cliffs that I just showed you, you would not see it. These flowers are less than 1/16 of an inch in diameter. And this syrphid fly that's on them is so small that unless you've got your nose right in there, you would barely see him. So I used a 100mm macro lens for this. And it makes it look like a really lush exotic plant, but it's extremely tiny and fragile and just barely hangs on to the hillsides. Wild ginger. Those of you who live around here in southern Vermont likely know of many hillsides where this grows. It's a little more tolerant of different kinds of conditions. So you will find it with plants that can take a slightly lower pH than some of these initial ones that I showed you. But it's very hard to see the bloom. The flowers are right down against the ground, and beetles and flies are the pollinators. It has a particularly attractive scent for them, which is not attractive to us. But it's a beautiful plant, and the leaves do not die back. They, right away anyway, they stay green and lush through most of the spring and early summer, sometimes longer. Christmas fern is also very common on these hillsides, and I think help hold the moisture in. There's a lot of them, and laying down along those slopes, which otherwise would dry out quite rapidly as the springtime progresses into summer. So I think they really help with moisture retention there. This is looking back down the area we just walked through and where the plants are growing. This is another one of my favorites. I just learned, and some of you may know this information better than I, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, but I was not aware until this week that there are 2 species of blue cohosh in this area. One that blooms before the leaves unroll, like this, is Calophyllum giganteum, early blue cohosh. And the other one blooms after the leaves or with the leaves unrolling, and the flowers are quite a different color, as you can see between the two, as are the stems. These more purpley ones will green out as they finally open up. And both can grow together, and in this particular location where I was, they do. Another plant that you'll often see in this habitat budding up at exactly the same time is red elderberry. And they usually catch your eye because they shoot out a really long leader stem, and then these flowers come out through little axils along the stem. They don't really branch like a shrub. So they really catch your eye because they create all these linear lines and put the leaves up as high as they can to catch the sunlight. So you get this beautiful backlit effect above your head. The moss on these cliffs is fantastic. And I wish I knew mosses, but life is too busy for me right now to stop and figure that out. And I have actually asked a couple people about the one on the right and haven't yet gotten a definitive answer. But one of the reasons I'm showing you this cliff is because nestled in these beautiful green cushions are maidenhair spleenwort and herb robber, which is a tiny geranium with very small pink flowers. And this maidenhair spleenwort is everywhere in this habitat and is actually a very prolific miniature fern, particularly up here in southern Vermont. But we also had it growing in Concord. For those of you I know who are on tonight from Concord, it grows in Canantum and the Esterbrook Woods there, where there is some calcite in the geology in both of those spots. And herb robert grows in those same two places. Ebony spleenwort was not at this site we're sort of virtually walking through, but it is in this area, and it does grow in very similar locations. Looks a little like Christmas fern, but the fronds are much much narrower, and you'll see the pinnae are more finely spaced, and there are other things that help you tell them apart. So now I'm going to take a little interlude here to talk about threats and disruptions to these habitats. This is going on right next to what I just showed you. It is a municipal forestry clearing, and there are clear cuts right next to it. They are not currently clear cutting at the top of these cliffs that I showed you or right up next to them, although the area next to them beyond them was clearly both clear cut or wiped out during a hurricane of '38 and is replanted in red pine. The problem now with clear cuts and using that, or even heavy forest thinning, and the strategy is being questioned now for two reasons. One, climate change is really putting the pressure on us to consider alternatives that are going to release more carbon into the atmosphere. Maturing forests are major sequesterers of carbon dioxide. And when you clear cut, you remove the ability of the forest to do that. You also remove diversity. And you introduce a major opportunity for invasive plant species to move in. They are going to take advantage of this in a heartbeat, and they're already here. So we can expect in areas that have this happening, which is happening in the Brattleboro area around all of the reservoirs. We'll expect to see more buckthorn and bittersweet especially. See, the cliffs are over there and we're right across from them. But also these plants, this one here on the cliff, which really does beautifully in environments that these ephemerals love, is greater celandine. And it's in the poppy family. And those of you who are gardeners, no doubt have, especially if you're down in the valley or in its eastern Mass or residential areas, probably have this coming up in your garden. Do remove it. You will never fully get rid of it because it has little, I'm not sure, I can't remember the technical name, bulblets that it produces off its roots. So even if you pull up a plant, those remain in the soil to sprout new plants. But it is probably could potentially in areas like this be devastating to these hillsides. It comes up sooner than many of the ephemerals, and then it shades out the areas where they desperately need the sunshine. Wall lettuce, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, another introduction that also I found all over in spots on these cliffs, are particularly dangerous for here. You can see the little maidenhair fern hanging out just above, and there's some more greater celandine up here. Asian bittersweet, barberry, buckthorn, honeysuckle, myrtle, and very aggressive wild grape were all seen around this particular area of ephemerals. This is wall lettuce, which actually comes from the Caucasus Mountains in Eastern Europe. This is another area that along an old wood road with incredible outcrops. This is one that was probably both logged and hit by the hurricane, but has a lot of red pine, plantation red pine coming back in it. But the red pine looks totally out of place in an area that really should have birch, beech, and maple in it, because there's a lot of limestone in the rocks here. This wonderful stone wall that comes across the woodland and then leaps off the ledge and continues. This is looking up the other way. Now, I'm showing you these so that you look over to your left and you think there's nothing here at this time of year. But all of these rocks are terraced with hundreds of hepaticas and Dutchman's breeches and columbine and maidenhair fern. That's all Dutchman's breeches up there. Now I'm going to introduce a couple plants that are in southern Vermont, but I haven't seen them here yet. But they are recorded from this area. Early rue anemone. It's largely, I think, wind pollinated. And these flowers, male and female, the males come out first before the leaves unfurl, then the female as the leaves are unfurling. This particular photograph was taken in an area called the Estabrook Woods in Concord, Mass. It is thought that these are native to that spot, although those woods, which are, now I'm forgotten, they're close to 1,500 acres of woods that's mostly owned by Harvard University and a lot of contiguous private landowners that have networks of trails. And there are a few spring ephemerals in there that were introduced by Minot Pratt, who was a botanist and a nurseryman in the 1860s. And I've worked with Ray Angelo, who used to be the curator of the New England Botanical Club Herbarium at Harvard, who has, if any of you are interested in wildflowers, you should Google Ray Angelo and go to his website. He has more resources on where plants are and all of the history of native plants and botany in Concord. But also he has just finished a mapping project that maps all the plants of New England with a map for each species. So you can see where there are herbarium samples for them. So he's got great resources for research. But this one we think was not introduced there. This little plant apparently has not been seen as a native in southeastern Vermont, in Windham County particularly, but in Bennington County it has, and in all of the western counties of Vermont and down through western Connecticut. It's a little bit more of a southern species, but this also is growing in Estabrook Woods, and it's really a beautiful, delicate plant about 3 inches high. So here we are up on a nearby mountain in the rich hardwood forest. And I'm just going to show you some of the same plants, but a few new ones that are growing in a similar habitat. It's a slope, it's not a cliff, but it has very rich soil. And some of the plants we saw down below are growing in much greater abundance up here because they've got a lot more nourishment and a lot less erosion. So there's Carolina Spring Beauty. This is a sedge, actually. So this is making this particular Spring Beauty look like the Virginia Spring Beauty, which has leaves that look just like this. But these are the leaves of this Spring Beauty, and they're wide. Carolina Spring Beauty is the most common one around here. Virginia Spring Beauty has also been found all over Vermont, but not abundantly. It's a much rarer plant. A family homestead of mine, which I've been working on the estate of in Concord, has an entire lawn full of Virginia Spring Beauty. And because my aunt who lived there is now deceased, I can't ask her how in heaven's name it got there. But the lawn is just full of it, and it's a very rare plant in Eastern Mass. This is one of my favorite plants, bloodroot. And I was fortunate enough to get this, this shot a few years ago of one just opening that had a nick in the leaf, so you can see where the name came from. The stems and the roots all exude a blood red juice. Sanguinaria canadensis. Beautiful, beautiful plant. It the female pistil ripens up ahead of the stamens here, and once the stamens have been pollinated, the petals fall off. Now, those of you around in Vermont see this everywhere here. It grows along many, many roadsides. One place you can see them from your car sometimes is along Kipling Drive on the way to Scott's Farm in Dummerston. But they readily seed themselves in open spaces along roadsides or on the edge of forests where there is a great deal of sunlight. This is trout lily, and the yellow form is the one that's common in New England, and obviously named for the leaf because it looks like a trout, and it has a tremendous amount of pollen. I would love to, I'd like to do more research so that I know more about how these are pollinated, but or how all the ephemerals are pollinated. But trout lily, I'm not able to access my notes tonight because I couldn't get that version to work on here. But if I can remember, the trout lily, when it produces seed, the seeds are attached to a little fatty pocket. Ants pollinate this plant. One of the pollinators. They come to eat the little eliosomes that are connected to the seeds, and they bring them down underground and as a food source, and thereby plant more trout lilies. I've recently read that like many orchids, it takes trout lilies up to 7 years to bloom from seed. And that if you find a large patch of trout lily that looks healthy, it Sorry, hold on. Large patches of trout lily may well be older than the trees around them. I'm not sure how they age trout lilies in the lab, but an article I was reading said that they have figured out that large persistent stands of trout lilies can be as old as 100 years or more old. And I'm assuming they're talking about the root systems because these are ephemeral. This is Bellwort, which typically grows in the woods, but since Irene, I've been finding it everywhere. There are washes of it along brooks. My daughter's property, which has a brook running through it, has a whole lower yard full of Bellwort that no doubt was washed there by the waters that came through during Irene. And I'm assuming that this little beetle has some kind of special pollinating or pollen eating relationship with this Bellwort because there aren't a tremendous amount of insects out at this time. So they're not going to waste their time going to a plant that isn't giving them something. This is wood anemone. It grows here, and it grows abundantly in Eastern Mass where the soils are more acidic. This is also one of my favorite plants. Not a great picture. I'm sorry. I took it with my old iPhone. It's a little graphic looking, but these are tiny plants, and they are related to American ginseng, but they're they're only about 4 inches high. Very hard to spot. I don't personally know yet of an area where they're prolific, but I found a handful of plants in this area that in this particular hardwood stand. And we're now up at an elevation of about 1,800 feet that these things are on. This is the blue cohosh that blooms and leaves out at the same time. And in this area, it is a major ground cover. It's very, very lush. And this little guy is a West Virginia white butterfly related to the cabbage butterflies that we all know. But he has a very particular affinity for toothwort. And the caterpillars of that butterfly, this is their host plant. This this is skunk cabbage over here, but here's the toothwort in here and some of its leaves. So the West Virginia white is quite rare, but we have them up here in Marlboro. That was where I took that picture. And one of the concerns for them are the perils of garlic mustard and the potential for garlic mustard to move into areas where dentaria or toothwort grow and both overtake the toothwort, but more importantly, fool the caterpillars of the West Virginia white. And so become a competitive host. They will not be, the caterpillars can't eat that plant, but there is concern about that. This is squirrel corn, which looks a whole lot like Dutchman's breeches, but also like a white version of bleeding heart. They can grow in the same place, and they do, apparently Patty was telling me at Bonnievale Environmental Center, they have both there. Dutchman's breeches and squirrel corn growing in the same forested area. But I saw these separately. More bristly gooseberry, and this is when you're not on a ledge and you really can run wild. It's going to be a pretty awesome ground cover later in the season. And the leeks do a little better when they're not on a ledge too. And so does the saxifrage. So you get a nice example in this really rich woodland area and slope where there is lots of lots of soil, lots of leaf litter to hold everybody together. How lush some of these ephemerals can get. This is a Canada violet, which just in early May will come out in the same area. And columbine. Columbine's everywhere. It's everywhere here. It's in those calcareous areas in Concord, Mass. And for reasons I don't understand, I've seen a lot of it on Cape Cod, which I think of as a largely an acidic environment. And foam flower, which is quite common here. Also beautiful, many of these plants, not all, will do well in a native plant garden. If you want to purchase those, I'll give you some resources at the end for purchasing native plants to grow. But this is one that many people do grow because it makes a beautiful heart-leafed ground cover, and then these foamy flowers, which aren't fully open here, that just have a very soft effect that hover above them. And this is gold thread, not an ephemeral per se, because those of us who know it know those leaves are a ground cover where they grow all through the growing season. Very tiny flowers close to the ground, really, really pretty plant. And if you just tug lightly at the base of it and pull up the root just a bit, you'll see that the roots are a beautiful golden color, which is where the name came from. So I'm getting close to the end here. I wanted to include some early plants that catch our attention more readily than the ones I showed you, but are blooming just before or right at the same time, so that you have a sense of sort of everything going on in this period of the spring. This is coltsfoot up close. Coltsfoot, in Vermont and Western Connecticut, I spent my early years in Western Connecticut, and it meant spring to me along the dirt roadsides, and it's everywhere here along the roadsides, very resilient. Was brought here largely as a medicinal from Europe. It's not native. It's becoming invasive in eastern Massachusetts, where it wasn't that common. In Concord, interestingly, it has just taken off within the last 5 or 6 years, and only in those areas like around Walden Pond and a few other areas where the railroad tracks go through. So the seeds have been dispersed probably via the railroad because it's the only areas that we find it. But here it's everywhere and it's beautiful. Skunk cabbage. Skunk cabbage can come, you can see it burning through the snow if the snow's not too deep, back in February. But the skunk cabbage will come up in March. It usually blooms in March, very early April, depending in Windham County, depending on whether you're down in the valley or up above 1,400 feet. The time will vary. There's not that, I don't see that much skunk cabbage up in Marlboro, but as you begin to go down the mountain towards Brattleboro, there's more and more of it. False hellebore is what we have more commonly, and I'll get to that. Trailing arbutus. We used to have some here at the Nevins homestead, along the brooks, but the forests have grown up so much there's not enough light now. But this is a very common plant in more acidic soils. This picture was taken over in the New Boston Cemetery in West Chesterfield on the Gulf Road. Somehow it got established there, and it's beautiful. But it's prolific up in Maine, down East Maine. It's all over New England. And it's very, very early blooming. These are the wonderful pleated bullet buds of false hellebore coming up. I love this plant, and it's I just love the way the light catches it. I have a whole portfolio of this plant, and I've done a lot of it in black and white. And then I found out that the famous photographer in the F64 club, Imogene Cunningham, she did 2 portraits of false hellebore in black and white. You know, I was surprised she even knew what it was. But you can see why people like to honor it. And marsh marigolds, they're around here in sort of low seep areas, woodland seeps, shallow brooks down in the flats. So West Brattleboro flats, not so much in hilly areas. And I think they prefer warmer conditions than going up the mountains here. And spicebush. So we discovered there's some spicebush over in West Brattleboro where we were looking at ephemerals in the streams there. It's more of a southern plant. It's not that common up here. It's pretty much the 2 southern Vermont counties and south and east. But in eastern Massachusetts, in the woodlands, it's everywhere. And I spent so much time around it in early spring. I tried to get photographs that captured the feel of being in the middle of a spicebush thicket. And this is one of my favorites, is any species of shadbush. The one most common up here is lavis, Amelanchier lavis, and these are on our property. There's Amelanchier canadensis in Concord is very common, and shad, for many of us who have been keeping records for years or decades on first blooms, shad is one of the primary indicator plants that has helped everyone from now back to Thoreau's time track how on time the spring season is. And the shad, I'm beginning to build records here of when it comes out. And here it comes out in Marlboro at 1,600 feet. It comes out around the 9th of May. In Concord, in Mass, when we first moved there, it came out every year on the 4th or 5th of May until the 1990s. And within that 10-year decade, it shifted a whole 2 weeks to coming out reliably thereafter, always around the 27th of April, which was 2 weeks earlier than Thoreau recorded it. So this is going to lead me into mentioning something about keeping records and how those of us, me and Thoreau and my aunt and others that I know who've been fastidious record keepers of birds coming and going. My father-in-law, John Nevins, I found 1940s records of all the comings and goings of birds that I will eventually put on eBird. You know, everyone thought we were, you know, just sort of nerdy and doing that. Now these records have become really valuable, and we have 2 platforms that have become global that we can put our records in that are really helping scientists look at and map the changes that are occurring. This is a plant I really want to know the whereabouts of. Getting close to the end here. This is what John Nevins, my father-in-law, called his holy grail. And he was the one who really encouraged me to learn my wildflowers back in the 70s and wanted me to find Wikipedia. He apparently knew that Thoreau had seen it when he made his 5-day visit to Brattleboro. I didn't find that out until years later. And I swear I saw, not in his journal, but somewhere, that Thoreau found it along the whetstone, but it was the first time he'd ever seen it. And John, I think, passed away without ever having found it. The picture on the left is one that I borrowed off the internet, and I will not use it beyond this talk because I don't have one of it in flower yet. The one on the right is from Bonnievale, and we did find some shrubs there. But I would love to know where it grows so that I can watch it, you know, week to week in future years. The wonderful thing about leatherwort or Wikipedia, which is the indigenous name for it, is that these stems are completely pliable and can be used as tethers or rope or not cordage, because you don't actually pull the fibers out, but you actually can bend them and tie them. So that's how it got its common name. So this ends the sampling of ephemerals and other floral friends with our little wild steward, and he's one of so many critters who are helping to keep the flora going in one way or another, whether they eat it or propagate it or sip the nectar or keep foes at bay. So I just want to say a little something about the benefits of smartphones and crowdsourcing in botanizing and birding. Here I'm with a group of naturalists. I was with them last weekend and led them on an ephemerals walk. And this fellow is photographing one of those mitellas or miterworts, and it's right here. So you can see how tiny it is. The importance of iNaturalist is that iNaturalist is an international database now, supported by a number of constituencies, including several in Canada, the US, National Geographic. The database has become very quickly in the last maybe 5 to 6 years so full that they have a visual recognition feature in there that if you see a plant you don't know, you can use iNaturalist or its companion app, Seek, to actually photograph the plant and see if you can get an ID from it. And it uses visual recognition and artificial intelligence to bring up very often the correct answer. I've been using or watching, and now more recently using iNaturalist, but watching it since it started, waiting for it to get good enough to use. But this is where, you know, if you're going on a walk, you can record what you see and put it up into this database. You can make it a public post or you can obscure the locations, but all of that data is available to scientists to use. And it also helps people like us who go on the website to pull up a plant and see where people have seen it and get an idea of distributions or where we might want to go for a walk. So I have 2 more slides after this, but I just want to end to say one of the best ways we can steward the environment is to inspire our kids and grandkids to really love being outdoors and getting to know what's there. And this is my grandchild. This past summer, he was 3, and that picture of me on the right, he took with my iPhone. And it's the best photo of me anyone's taken in a long time. So another plus for iPhones. He's got a little hand lens here and is looking at a green bog orchid, which I'm going to forget the name of right now because I'm getting tired. But anyway, it's the one with the green flowers and the very lacerated petals. And we have about 200 of them out in our mowing. So I'm going to end with these resources, and I put them up in writing since we're recording this, so that people can get them at their leisure. But if any of you want, and many of you are tuning in, I know you already know a lot of this information, but some of you may not. And the New England Wildflower Society changed its name recently to the Native Plant Trust. I worked there as their first education director in the 70s. They are a phenomenal organization. They were then, and they sort of mind-blowingly complex and fabulous as a resource. But they support Go Botany, which is the best online identification and sort of atlas of native plants of New England. They have Nasami Farm, which is a large native plant nursery that's very close to here, just down in Whately, Mass, over the border. If any of you are interested in gardening with native plants, I always say that it is important never to take plants from the wild, always to get propagated material. And if you're buying from nurseries like Walker Farm or any others in the Boston area, there's a lot of large ones. If you find native plants in those places that aren't Nasami, ask where they got them, because some nurseries buy from collectors, but good nurseries do not. And the Native Plant Trust also on their website has terrific resources on growing native plants. So there's a lot of information there to help that along. One fabulous place to go to see lots of spring ephemerals is Bartholomew's Cobble over in Sheffield, Mass. I took some people out there on trips when I was at the Wildflower Society, 40 years ago, but it was really far flung from the Boston area. Now it's really pretty close, and it's really a spectacular high, 1,000 feet up cobble of sweet rock that has just beautiful wildflowers on it. What happened? Oh, geez. Hold on. Sorry, my phone just killed it. All right, here we go. Is that gonna work? Oh, for heaven's sakes. Hold on. Stop share. All right. I'm going to stop rather than keeping you waiting while I try to find that. But the other resources I had are just links about iNaturalist and Seek. And also a companion, if you're a birder, obviously is eBird. They all work similarly. They track where you go. When you post things, it says you've seen such and such in a certain place. So they collect a lot of information in a way we've never been able to do before. One thing I should say for those of you who might get eager about using iNaturalist to record when you see plants, and particularly spring ephemerals, which have great appeal to people who are not fully educated about how delicate and fragile and scarce they are, is not, I recommend, if you use an iNaturalist, there are 3 levels of publication for the post that you put on. There's a full public share, which includes a point right in the GPS location that you've seen the plant. So for instance, if you're walking along ledges looking at ephemerals and you put up all your posts on iNaturalist, and you're, especially if you're with a group and everybody puts their post up and somebody calls up something like Dutchman's Breeches, you will see a map with little dots going right in a line up along a roadside that just kind of shouts out, this is a cliffside with spring ephemerals. So I recommend using the obscure level, which will put a red circle around the general area that you saw something without giving someone a trail map right to where they are. The question was raised to me earlier today. What about if municipal departments want to refer to iNaturalist to see if construction projects might be taking place in a fragile area? And my answer to that is going to be, I haven't had time to answer the email yet, that if they're using iNaturalist already, they can email the person who made the post and say, I see that you obscured the post. We have a planned project. Can you tell me a little more about the area? So I don't personally see a reason to have to make those kinds of records so specifically public with GPS points. Anyway, I'm going to stop now and let you ask questions and let my voice just rest for a second. But
Cherrie, we have quite a few questions in the chat box.
okay.
Someone said, where in the Concord area do you suggest to find them? I'm assuming we mean spring ephemerals.
Yeah.
You mentioned
so,
at least one spot, I know, but.
Yeah, yes, and I can tell you because it's a pretty public spot, and the more people who know and care about it, the more they may be there to tell the trail bikers to get the heck out of there. But one of the places in Concord is the Estabrook Woods at the lime quarries, which are marked on several maps that are available through the town of Concord and other places. But there is a place where lime was quarried out in the Estabrook Woods to make plaster in the, couple hundred years ago. And there are native spring ephemerals growing right out of those rocks. And some of the pictures that I took were from there. The other place is in Conantum, which is over across the Sudbury River in West Concord. And that has some natural bedrock there that's sweet. Martha's Point, right out on the Sudbury River, has some ephemerals. Not a good place to walk because you step right on the early saxifrage. It's been pretty trampled out there, but also up in the hillsides, any of the woodlands in Conantum are pretty rich in some of those plants.
Somebody asked if you could explain the importance of ephemerals.
Well, I think the importance has to do with their relationships. They come out early, and from here on in, when I'm photographing spring ephemerals, I'm going to try to find them in communion with insects. I think that's a big piece. A lot of the bee flies, the bumblebees, the early bumblebees that come out early, the syrphid flies, and some of those other, and beetles, certain beetles that come out early, they all rely, many of them rely on these spring ephemerals. Some of them pollinate them, so they're helping the plants. Others, especially the syrphid flies, eat the pollen, so that's giving them some protein and nourishment. The ants, like the elaeosomes, several of the spring ephemerals have those little starchy, sweet elaeosome packets attached to their seeds to attract the ants. So the plant's getting propagated, the ants getting food. So I think that's a really important piece, is that they're part of an early spring ecology, in addition to just being lovely for us to look at. As you could see from the cliffside, they're really resilient at populating habitats that virtually nothing else would grow on. So.
Someone asked if you could say something about grass of Parnassus.
No. Sorry, I don't know much of anything. I mean, I know the plant, but if anybody else can, that would be great. It's not one I've encountered a lot, or had to lead walks past, so I haven't learned much about it. Sorry.
And then a couple of people reporting that they have leatherwood, including on Windmill Hill Pinnacle Lane land on the west slope of Windmill Ridge.
Great. Thank you. I've been told to go up there for ephemerals and other things too. I hear it's a big area. So there's a lot up there. Yeah.
And then Cheryl wanted to say that she has Dutchman's breeches and bloodroot to give away, and she put her email address in the chat box if anybody's interested.
Yes, I know. This is Cheryl Mandler, is it? Is it?
I just scrolled
I'm
past.
trying to follow you. Where is that? Oh
Cheryl
no, Cheryl
Wilfong.
Wilfong. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Nice.
And then if folks have more questions, you can put them in the chat box, or you can just unmute and ask your question.
Who's here? No
So
more
I'm
questions.
Jonathan Morse,
Hi, Jonathan.
neighbor with Cherrie, and we've been, we have this bobcat that is roaming our neighborhood. And I want you to tell me, Cherrie, if we should be concerned. Is it something which is perhaps it's sick? Why is it out so much?
Well, a lot of things are out a lot now, because it's been a tough winter, and this bobcat is very small. So my guess it's a she. And if it's a she, she's probably out getting as much nourishment and food as possible, if she possibly has kids to feed. Or she's just out eating, because we've had fox roaming around, the porcupines are roaming around.
Yeah.
I expect the bears will show up next week. You know, it's been a tough winter. The snow was so deep, nothing could get around to eat. So I wouldn't worry. She's coming out, between 4 and 6 o'clock most of the time. Unless it's out like around noon, that would be odd behavior. But if it's early morning, late afternoon, that's when they should be out.
That's when we're.
And if you have an outdoor cat, you all know that if you do, you shouldn't. I used to have one, and it was a wonderful cat, but finally it was taken by a coyote in Concord from the backyard on a very hot morning when the coyotes were stressed for food. So if you have small pets that you have outdoors, just take care of them right now. These weeks leading into early May, all the wild animals are pretty desperate to catch up on nutrition that they, kind of couldn't get over the winter. And yeah, so just take care. I don't think that bobcat's a problem yet.
Thank you.
Other questions for Cherrie?
Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. And it's lovely to see all my local friends and so many old friends' names up here, from all over California to Massachusetts and Maine.
Well, thank you so much for presenting this evening. This was
Yeah,
fascinating.
you're welcome. Thank you.